You are now settling in, letting the noise of the day fall quiet. The world outside drifts away and you are safe here, listening to a story not of a king or conqueror, but of a man who began in silence, in soil, in shadow. I was not born into riches, nor into halls of marble, but into fields where the earth itself seemed endless, where the air smelled of wood smoke and damp ground, and where the stars looked close enough to touch. The night of my beginning was cold, though the cabin walls were too thin to keep the wind out. My cradle was not crafted by skilled hands, but pieced together with what little could be found. We were poor, poorer than most, and yet it was not the kind of poverty one can escape by moving to another place. It was a poverty woven into the frontier itself, a roughness of land, of labor, of life. I grew among trees that stretched tall, their branches clawing at the sky, and fields that seemed to whisper with each wind. The soil gave little without demand. Corn and pumpkins would grow if you wrestled with the ground, if you bent your back long enough, if you accepted that the harvest would never be generous, only enough to keep you alive for another season. My earliest memories are of work, chopping, lifting, carrying, sweating under a sun that showed no mercy. There were no tutors, no masters of books, no fine cloth to wear. Instead, there were axes and plows, mud and splinters, calluses forming too soon on hands too small. But hardship was not the only shadow that shaped me. Loss came early. My mother, who had been the anchor of our small world, grew ill when I was still a boy. The sickness swept through like a storm, quick and merciless. I remember her voice fading, her body weak, her hands too light to hold, and then she was gone. The cabin felt emptier than ever after that. Her absence was like a hole in the roof where rain would never stop pouring in. My father worked harder, growing sterner, less patient. He had little time for softness and less still for grief. But grief stayed with me. It settled in my bones, made me quiet, made me watchful. Others saw a boy standing in the corner, tall and awkward, but inside me was a well too deep for words. It was perhaps that silence, that loneliness, which first pushed me towards something more. There were few books in our world, fewer still that a boy like me could call his own. But when I found them, in the hands of neighbors, in borrowed scraps, in pages tattered and worn, I clung to them as though they were treasure. I read by firelight until my eyes ached, sounding out words that felt heavy with meaning I could not yet grasp. Some nights I would lie awake, the log walls around me creaking, the wind whistling through the cracks, and I would repeat the words in my mind. Not because I was taught to, but because they stirred something in me, something that the fields and the axe could never reach. Yet knowledge was not a shield against labor. Each day brought its demand. I split rails, clearing land for fences that never seemed to end. I hauled logs, built barns, tended crops, hunted in woods that stretched forever. My body grew before my years, tall and lanky, hands rougher than many grown men's. Neighbors joked that I was built for work and little else. Some whispered I was too strange, too long-limbed, too quiet to fit among them. I did not argue. I rarely argued then. I let their words pass as the wind passes over tall grass. But inside I carried a hunger, one I could not name. A hunger to be more than the soil beneath my feet, more than the sweat on my brow, more than the shadow of grief that followed me wherever I went. It was in those silent fields, under skies both merciless and kind, that my spirit took its shape. Hardship carved me, loss hollowed me, and yet there was something more. I remember one night in particular, lying on my back in the clearing outside the cabin. The stars hung above me like lanterns strung across black velvet. I felt smaller than ever, smaller than the trees, smaller than the insects buzzing in the grass. And yet, I felt also that the vastness above had left some place for me, that in the endless sky there was room even for a boy born in silence, in shadow, in sorrow. But that was not the whole story, for the world beyond those fields was changing. Whispers of new towns, new roads, new ideas drifted toward us like smoke on the wind. Men spoke of laws, of politics, of freedoms and bonds. I did not yet understand their meaning, but I listened. Always, I listened. Some nights the adults gathered, their voices low, debating matters that seemed beyond the reach of our small lives. Taxes, land disputes, the question of slavery that hung like a storm cloud over the nation. I was a boy in the corner, unnoticed, yet every word sank into me. I think now that my silence was not emptiness but preparation, for while others talked, I absorbed. While others shouted, I studied. While others argued over who was right, I carried away the memory of their words, rolling them over in my mind, testing them against each other like stones struck together to spark fire. And though I did not know it then, the fire had already begun. The boy in the cabin, barefoot in the fields, grieving his mother, mocked for his strangeness. He was not meant to remain there forever. The soil that weighed upon me, the silence that filled me, the loss that marked me, these were not chains, but roots. And from roots, something grows. But what grew in me was not simple, not easy, not quick. It would take years and more hardship still before anyone would notice, before anyone would believe. For now I remained in the silent fields, a boy with little but a restless spirit, a mind hungry for words and a sense, faint but certain, that my story was only beginning. The cabin walls could never hold me. They pressed in too tightly, not in wood or space, but in the limits they carried. I felt it even as a boy, the sense that my body was bound to hard labor, yet my mind strained against those walls, reaching for something unseen. Work came first, always. I split rails until my hands blistered, cleared fields where stumps rose like stubborn teeth, and trudged behind plows that carved the soil inch by inch. My body hardened into its tall, awkward shape. Neighbors said I was built for swinging an axe and little else, and for a time they were right. I swung that axe from dawn until the sky burned orange at dusk. But the hunger inside me was not for food alone. It was for words, for knowledge, for something beyond the endless rhythm of chop, drag, haul, sweat. Books were scarce, as rare as silver, yet I searched for them like a starving man hunts for bread. I borrowed from neighbors who owned more than I, read by the dim glow of firelight, bending over pages until the letters blurred. The Bible, Pilgrim's Progress, Aesop's Fables, these were not just stories but windows. Each word seemed to open a door to a world larger than mine, to thoughts bigger than the cabin walls, to truths that felt eternal. I remember pressing my face close to a borrowed book, tracing the words with my finger, as though touching them might make them part of me. And perhaps it did. For though my body ached from labor, my mind stretched in ways no plow could measure. Some laughed at me for it. They saw me with a book in hand and shook their heads. What good will that do, they asked. Words won't build fences. Words won't split rails. Perhaps they were right, for words fed no mouths. Yet something in me whispered that words could do more than any axe, if only I learned how to wield them. So I read. I copied passages on scraps of wood, repeated them aloud until the cadence settled into my bones. I memorized tales of kings and heroes, of journeys and trials, though I was but a boy with nothing more noble than chores and hunger. But knowledge, once tasted, does not let go. It clings, it calls, it insists. I worked many jobs, each one more tiring than the last, but all the while I carried my secret hunger. I ferried travelers across rivers, straining at the poles that pushed the flatboat forward. I clerked in a store, stacking goods, weighing out grain, listening to the endless chatter of customers. I tried my hand at farming, though the land seemed to resist me as much as I resisted it. None of these tasks filled me with joy, but each taught me something. Ferrying taught me the currents of rivers. Clerkship taught me the current of men. I learned to listen, to notice, to watch. Every insult, every compliment, every whispered rumor lodged itself in my mind. And still I read. Neighbors began to notice the tall, awkward boy who seemed as interested in books as in work. Some mocked me, some dismissed me, but a few began to lend me more volumes. Shakespeare, Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England. These were no longer just words, but instruments. I devoured them, tested them, shaped my tongue around their rhythm. It was not only reading that stirred me, but speaking. I discovered that words once learned could be spoken aloud in ways that made men stop and listen. At gatherings, I would try my hand at jokes, at little stories, at arguments. At first, I was clumsy, my voice strange, my frame towering too much above the crowd. But I saw the way faces turned, the way laughter spread, the way silence could fall when a tale took hold. That silence was power, and I hungered for it as much as for the words themselves. Yet beneath the growing confidence was always doubt. I was still the boy of the silent fields, poor, unrefined, mocked for my looks, my clothes, my lack of polish. I could not dance as others did, nor charm with smooth speech. My laughter was too loud, my movements too large, my features too plain. Some whispered I would always be nothing more than a curiosity, a tall rail splitter with his nose in a book. But whispers do not decide destiny. I remember once walking miles just to hear a trial in a distant town. I stood outside the small courthouse, straining to listen. The lawyer inside spoke with such force that the room fell utterly still. His words cut sharper than any axe, carried farther than any plow. I watched the faces of the jury, the crowd, the judge, all caught in the net of one man's voice. It struck me then with more force than any labor. Words could move men. Words could shape decisions, change minds, alter the course of lives. The lawyer held no weapon, yet he carried victory in his mouth. I returned home that night, restless, unable to sleep. The image haunted me, a man commanding not with fists, not with force, but with reason, with rhythm, with truth, or at least the appearance of it. And I thought, perhaps I could learn to do the same. But to dream such a dream was dangerous for one like me. Poverty chained me, labor demanded me, loss still haunted me. And yet the dream grew, stubborn as the weeds in our fields. There were other losses too, for life on the frontier was never gentle. Friends taken by sickness, neighbors swallowed by accidents, families broken by hardship. Each grave dug in the frozen ground reminded me how brief life could be. Perhaps that is why I read so fiercely, why I reached so hungrily. I knew I might not have long and I would not waste it. Still, I remained unsure. I was a boy on the edge of manhood, uncertain of what path to take, certain only that the soil beneath me could not hold me forever. The hunger in me grew sharper, the sense that my story was not meant to remain small. And though I did not yet know where it would lead, I felt the first stirrings of ambition. It whispered to me in the night as the fire crackled low, "There is more than this, there is more." And in time I would answer that whisper. For words had begun to shape me, and soon I would begin to shape the world with them. Ambition is a curious thing. It begins not as fire, but as an ember. It glows quietly, almost unseen, until the right wind stirs it into flame. For years, my hunger for words had been that ember, tucked inside me as I split rails and ferried travelers across the river. But as I grew taller, older, more restless, the ember began to burn. I'd worked many jobs, wandering from place to place, never settling long. The farm, the river, the store, each one gave me experience, but none gave me purpose. I was a man in motion without direction, searching for something I could not yet name. It was during these years that I found myself drawn more often into debate. At taverns, in fields, at crossroads where men gathered to talk, I began to test my voice. I argued about laws I barely understood, about ideas I had read in scraps of books. My voice was awkward at first, too high, too thin, but it carried conviction. And to my surprise, people listened. Some laughed, some jeered, but others leaned closer. It was then I realized I did not need to be polished or handsome to hold attention. I needed only truth, or at least the appearance of truth, shaped with words sharp enough to cut. This new confidence carried me into politics. I was still young when I first ran for the state legislature in Illinois. I had no money, no connections, no name that carried weight. I was nothing more than a rail splitter with ambition. Yet I declared my candidacy boldly. believing that honesty and determination might lift me where birth and wealth could not. The campaign was humbling. I walked miles to shake hands, to speak with farmers in their fields, to gather with townsfolk in their squares. I promised nothing more than hard work and honesty. If elected, I told them, I will do the best I can. Simple words, yet they carried me further than I expected. But not far enough. I lost. Defeat is a bitter taste, and I drank it deeply. Neighbors whispered that I had reached too high too soon. Some mocked me for daring at all. They pointed to my patched clothes, my awkward frame, my lack of polish, and said I would never be more than I was. Perhaps they were right. For a time, I sank into doubt, questioning whether my hunger had led me astray. Yet even in defeat, I felt something stir within me. I had tasted the work of politics, and though I lost, I could not turn away. The ember of ambition flared brighter. I threw myself back into labor, into study, into law. The law became my next great pursuit, for I had seen how it shaped lives as surely as rivers shaped land. I read every legal volume I could lay hands on, copying passages until my fingers cramped. I studied cases, tested arguments aloud, imagined myself standing before juries. Slowly, I built a foundation not of wealth or birth, but of knowledge. Alongside this, I returned to politics. A few years after my first defeat, I ran again. This time, the outcome was different. I was elected. The boy mocked for his awkwardness, the young man dismissed for his poverty, now carried a seat in the Illinois legislature. It was a small beginning, but it was a beginning. Serving there, I discovered both my strengths and my weaknesses. I was no great speaker in those days, not yet. My voice lacked music. My appearance drew stares. But I listened more than I spoke, and when I did rise, I chose my words carefully. My colleagues began to notice that when I spoke, it was with honesty, with clarity, with purpose. Still, doubts clung to me. Some called me too plain, too awkward, too unrefined to climb higher. Others whispered that I was driven by ambition too large for my frame. He wants more than he deserves, they said, and perhaps I did. For ambition is never satisfied. During these years, I also felt the stirrings of love and loss. My heart was drawn to women who at times seemed beyond my reach. I faced rejection, heartbreak, confusion. My courtship of Mary Todd, who would later become my wife, was stormy, filled with quarrels and reconciliations. Rumors spread that I was too poor, too uncertain, too strange for her. Yet somehow, through turbulence, we found each other. These personal struggles deepened my character. They reminded me that ambition is not only public, but private. To build a life is as difficult as to build a career. And in both, doubt is a constant companion, but ambition is stubborn. It grows where it is unwelcome. It drives where reason counsels rest. Mine pushed me to continue, to rise, to speak louder, clearer, stronger. I began to notice something else. When I spoke of common men, of farmers and laborers, they listened. They saw in me not a polished gentleman above them, but one of their own. My hands were as calloused as theirs, my clothes as plain, my childhood as rough. I carried no airs of superiority, and because of that, they trusted me. Trust became my greatest weapon. It outweighed my lack of beauty, my lack of refinement. In a world where lies were common, a reputation for honesty was rare, and I guarded mine fiercely. Yet honesty alone could not carry me forever. I needed vision. I needed to show not only that I was one of them, but that I could lead them to something greater. The nation was changing. Whispers of division grew louder. The question of slavery cast a shadow across every conversation, every law, every compromise. I did not yet speak boldly on it, but inside, I wrestled with its weight. The time would come when I could not remain silent, but that was not yet. For now I was still the young man from the frontier, testing his voice, building his reputation, shaping his ambition into something steadier. And though I had won small victories, greater storms lay ahead. For ambition, once awakened, never sleeps. It drives onward, always onward, toward heights unseen. toward trials unimagined, toward a destiny both glorious and grave. The law came to me not as inheritance but as hunger. I had no wealthy patron to guide me, no polished education to smooth my path. I had only books, borrowed and worn, and a determination that would not rest. I read until my eyes blurred, copying passages by hand, testing arguments aloud in the stillness of night. Slowly, the shape of law revealed itself to me, not as distant theory, but as something living, something that governed every fence line, every debt, every quarrel between neighbors. When at last I stood in a courtroom, I felt again the same awe I had known as a boy, listening through the walls. Here, words held the power of hammers, striking truth into shape. Here, men's fates were decided not by strength of arms, but by persuasion of voice. I was not graceful in those days. My frame too tall, my movements awkward, my clothes plain against the polished coats of my peers. But when I spoke plainly, and juries listened. They saw not a man above them, but one of their own, standing in their stead. I argued with honesty, weaving stories they could understand, cutting through complexity with the sharp edge of simplicity. The law became my livelihood, carrying me from town to town, riding the circuit across fields and rivers, sleeping in taverns, in strangers' beds, sometimes beneath the stars. The road was long, but I found comfort in its rhythm. Each case brought new faces, new disputes, new chances to test myself. Some I won, some I lost, but with each trial I grew surer of my voice, my mind, my place. Yet, even as my work expanded, my heart faltered. Love came to me in ways as uneven as my steps. I knew affection, but also loss. There was a young woman, bright and kind, whose smile stirred something in me. We spoke often, and I dreamed of a life with her. But fate is cruel. She was taken by sickness before such dreams could take root. The grief hollowed me, as grief had before. For months I wandered in shadow, speaking little, carrying her memory as though it were a stone bound to my chest. In time I found my way to another, Mary Todd, a woman of intelligence and spirit, sharp of mind and quick of temper. Our courtship was not smooth. We quarreled, parted, returned, struggled again. Some said we were mismatched, that her refinement would never suit my roughness, that her ambition would clash with mine. Perhaps they were right, for our life together was often stormy. Yet somehow, through those storms, we bound ourselves to one another. Marriage brought me stability and burden alike. The household demanded as much of me as the courtroom. Children came, their laughter brightening my days, though sorrow visited here too, as it always seemed to find me. Not all my sons would live to grow. I carried their absence with me, silent, steady, unable to speak of it without breaking. Even in my home, whispers followed me. Some said I was too distant, lost in thought, more wedded to my books than to my wife. Others said my melancholy weighed too heavily on those around me. Rumors swirled that I was unsuited for family life, too consumed by shadows to provide joy. I did not answer such whispers. I bore them, as I bore so much else, in silence. But if my heart was uncertain, my work only grew. The law gave me purpose, steadiness, a means to serve, and politics still called louder each year. I walked the line between them, balancing ambition with duty, finding in each courtroom another rehearsal for the greater stage I knew awaited. It is perhaps here, in this balance of love and loss, work and ambition, that I should name myself at last. I am Abraham Lincoln, the boy of the silent fields, the rail splitter who borrowed books by firelight, the awkward youth mocked for his plainness. That boy had grown into a man with a voice, with a name, with a destiny that could no longer be hidden in shadow. Yet even as I speak it now, I remember how fragile it all seemed then. For though I had begun to make a place in law and politics, the nation around me was stirring with divisions deeper than any I had yet faced. The question of slavery, once a whisper, had become a roar. The unions strained, cracks widening across every debate, every compromise. And I knew, though I could not yet see how, that my life would be bound to that fracture. that my name, now spoken, would one day be carried upon it, praised and cursed alike. But that lay ahead. For now I was a lawyer riding dusty roads, a husband in a stormy marriage, a father both blessed and bereaved. I was Abraham Lincoln, yes, but still only a man, uncertain, searching, carrying both love and loss in equal measure. And as always, I listened. I listened to the whispers, to the debates, to the voices of neighbors and strangers alike. For in those voices, I heard the sound of a nation straining, and I knew that one day I would be called to answer. The law gave me a living, but it was politics that gave me a calling. By the time I had built my practice and found some stability at home, the nation I served was anything but stable. The question that haunted every conversation, every chamber, every tavern was slavery. It divided households, divided states, divided Congress itself. For a long time I spoke cautiously. I had seen what words could do, how they could lift a man or destroy him. To speak openly against slavery in a land where half the nation defended it was to invite fury, ridicule, even violence. And yet, silence became harder with each passing year. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was the spark that lit me fully into politics again. It opened the door for slavery to spread where it had once been barred, tearing away fragile compromises that had held the Union together. I could not abide it. I felt it as a betrayal of both principle and promise. A house divided against itself cannot stand. That truth pressed upon me long before I spoke it aloud. So I returned to politics with more fire than before. I spoke in towns and halls to farmers and merchants, to lawyers and laborers. My words were not elegant, but they were plain, steady, sharp. I said what I believed, and though many cursed me for it, others began to listen. It was in this climate that I stood against Stephen Douglas. He was a man polished, practiced, confident. The little giant, they called him. He carried himself with authority, his words quick and biting. I was taller, plainer, slower of speech. Many thought the match was unfair, that I would be crushed beneath his skill. But debates are not won with polish alone. They are won with clarity, with conviction, with the ability to make truth plain. The debates between us carried across Illinois, drawing crowds by the thousands. Farmers left their fields, shopkeepers closed their doors, families gathered with children on their laps, all to hear two men argue over the soul of the nation. Douglas thundered about popular sovereignty, about each state's right to choose. I stood against him, insisting that slavery was not merely a local choice, but a moral wrong that threatened the very fabric of our union. I remember the faces in the crowds, worn, weathered, eager. Some glared, some nodded, some wept. My words were not smooth, but they were honest, and honesty has a way of seeping into hearts. The newspapers carried our debates far beyond Illinois, and suddenly my name was known where it had never been spoken before. But fame is a double-edged blade. With recognition came ridicule. Some mocked my voice, high and shrill compared to Douglas's booming tones. Others caricatured my height, my gaunt figure, my rough features. They called me a baboon, a rail-splitter unfit for high office, a backwoods clown who dared to speak of national matters. I laughed at some of it, winced at more, but did not turn back. For I knew that the fight was larger than my pride. Whispers circled too, darker ones, that I was too radical, that I would destroy the Union with my talk, that I sought not compromise but chaos. Others claimed I was too cautious, too unwilling to strike hard against slavery's defenders. Each side tugged at me, demanding I be more than I was, and yet I could only be what I was. A man who believed slavery was wrong, and who would not be silent about it. As the years passed, the division grew sharper. Neighbors turned against neighbors, churches split, states threatened secession. The Union trembled like a tree in storm winds, and still Congress bickered, unable to steady it. I felt the storm rising in my bones. Each speech, each debate, each whisper of violence in Kansas or Missouri told me the same truth. A great reckoning was coming. I did not seek it, did not desire it, but I knew it was near. When I spoke those words, "A house divided against itself cannot stand," I did not speak them lightly. I spoke them as warning, as prophecy, as truth carved from bitter observation. I knew they would echo beyond me, and they did. Some praised me for my courage, others condemned me as a traitor. But no one ignored me. And in politics, to be ignored is death. The nation divided, and so too did my fate. The man once mocked for his plainness now found his name carried into parlors and newspapers across the land. My speeches were printed, my debates repeated, my image drawn both as hero and as villain. Yet in the quiet of night, when the crowds were gone and the papers folded, I felt the weight of it press upon me. I was no longer only a lawyer, no longer only a husband, a father, a man of Illinois. I was becoming something else, something I had not sought but could not refuse. And in that becoming, I sensed both promise and doom. For the nation was not merely debating law, it was tearing itself apart. And soon words would not be enough to hold it. I never sought the highest office with eagerness. Ambition carried me far, yes, but the weight of the presidency was one I knew would be measured not in glory but in grief. Yet fate is no respecter of readiness. It carries a man where he must go, not where he wishes. When my name was put forward for the presidency, I felt the ground shift beneath me. I had risen from poverty, from rails and fields, into courts and debates, but now the eyes of a nation rested upon me. Some looked with hope, others with fury, but none with indifference. The election of 1860 was unlike any before. 4 candidates split the nation, each carrying fragments of its soul. My victory came not with overwhelming majority, but with division. I won without the South, and the Union cracked the moment my name was declared. States whispered of secession before the ballots were cold. Their leaders swore they would not live under my rule, that my presence itself was an insult, a threat, a dagger at their throats. I had not yet set foot in Washington, and already the Union was breaking apart. The journey to the capital was heavy with danger. Rumors swirled of plots against my life, whispers that I would not live to take the oath. In Baltimore, word reached us of men lying in wait, armed, ready to strike me down before I could ascend. Friends insisted I alter my route, traveling in secrecy, hidden from view. I agreed, though reluctantly. It was no noble procession, but a quiet, fearful passage. Some mocked me for it, calling me coward, ridiculing me as a president too timid to face the people. Yet had I ignored the warnings, I would not have lived to govern at all. When at last I stood beneath the Capitol dome, my hand upon the Bible, I felt the weight of history pressing down. The crowd before me was restless, divided. Cheers rose, but so too did jeers. So I spoke with all the steadiness I could summon, appealing to unity, to the bonds of brotherhood, to the better angels of our nature. Yet even as I spoke, I knew words alone could not bind a nation already breaking. Secession came swiftly. One by one, states fell away like stones pulled from a crumbling wall. Their leaders declared themselves free of the Union, raising their own banners, forming their own government. They seized forts, armories, arsenals. And when at last, in Charleston Harbor, the guns of Fort Sumter thundered, the war I had prayed to avoid began. I was now commander, not of a united people, but of a fractured one. The Union Army was unready, disorganized, lacking in numbers and discipline. Volunteers poured in, eager but untrained. Supplies were scarce, leadership uncertain. I spent my days in endless meetings, choosing generals, raising funds, pleading with Congress for support. Each decision felt like walking a narrow bridge over a pit with no bottom. And all the while, voices rose against me. Some said I was too slow, too cautious, unwilling to strike hard enough. Others accused me of tyranny, of overstepping my authority, of bending the Constitution to my will. Newspapers mocked me, caricatured me, called me a fool, a clown, a dictator in disguise. Letters arrived daily with threats, with curses, with condemnations. Yet I could not turn away. At night, when the White House grew still, I would walk its halls alone, the gas lamps flickering against the walls. I thought of the lives already lost, the families already broken, the nation already bleeding. I prayed for wisdom, for strength, for endurance. I thought of my own children, laughing in the rooms above, unaware of the storm raging beyond those walls. And I wondered if I had been foolish to accept this burden at all. But each morning I rose again, for I knew that if I faltered, the Union might falter with me. I did not believe myself chosen by destiny, nor anointed by greatness. I believed only that I had been called, and once called, I could not refuse. The war's early battles brought only humiliation. At Bull Run, our forces broke and fled, scattering before the enemy like leaves in wind. The South rejoiced, certain that our will was weak, that the Union would crumble quickly. Many in the North despaired, some even called for peace, for surrender, but I would not yield. Defeat, I had learned long ago, is not the end unless one accepts it. So I pressed on. I searched for generals with the will to fight, replacing one after another when they failed to act. I signed orders, raised regiments, poured every ounce of my strength into holding the Union together. And still, whispers followed me. Some said I was incompetent, others that I was power-hungry, a tyrant cloaked in plainness. Rumors of plots against my life grew constant. Even those closest to me feared each public appearance, each journey, each crowd. Yet I continued, for the work demanded it. Through it all I clung to a simple truth. The Union must endure. If it perished, the experiment of liberty itself would perish. If it survived, even through blood and fire, the hope of democracy would live for generations. I did not seek to be a war president. I did not wish for this burden. But history does not ask what we wish. It asks only what we will endure. And so, reluctantly, solemnly, I bore it. War is not banners and parades. It is hunger mud, screams that linger in the night long after the guns fall silent. The Civil War, as it came to be called, was not some distant conflict fought on foreign soil. It was a tearing apart of brothers, a struggle in our own fields and forests, our rivers and towns. Each casualty list carried names that echoed in both North and South. Each grave dug was a reminder that we were killing our own. I carried that knowledge with me every day. It pressed upon my shoulders like an iron yoke. Reports flooded my desk, of battles lost, of cities burned, of soldiers starving, of widows weeping. I read each letter, each telegram, each dispatch with a heart that grew heavier by the hour. To lead a nation in war is not to command glory, it is to command grief. In those early years, grief also visited my own house. My son Willie, a boy of bright spirit and gentle heart, fell ill in the White House. He weakened day by day, the fever refusing to release him. I sat by his bed, helpless, watching as his small chest rose and fell with increasing strain. No general, no army, no law could save him. When at last he breathed his last, the sound of Mary's cries filled the house. I buried my boy even as I buried thousands of other sons. His loss was not separate from the nation's loss. It was part of it, folded into the great grief that blanketed the land. Yet it cut me deeply. In the quiet of night, I would walk alone, speaking to him as though he could still hear me, asking for his forgiveness that I had not been able to save him. Mary sank into despair, her grief consuming her, while I swallowed mine in silence, for I had a nation still demanding my every breath. The war dragged on. Each general I placed in command seemed to falter. Some moved too slowly, others too recklessly. Some sought glory, others shrank from responsibility. I dismissed one after another, searching for a man who could carry the fight as it must be carried. All the while, critics sharpened their knives. They called me weak, indecisive, a leader unfit for war. The newspapers ridiculed me daily, their caricatures cruel, their words venomous. Yet I endured, for endurance was all I had. The battlefield became a place of endless sacrifice. I visited the camps, walked among the soldiers, their faces lined with dirt and exhaustion. They cheered when they saw me, though I knew not why. I had given them little but orders that carried them to suffering. Yet still they looked at me with trust, with hope, as though I embodied something larger than either of us could name. I saw men missing limbs, men coughing blood, men clutching letters from home, as though those scraps of paper were the only thing binding them to life. I shook their hands, spoke with them, tried to let them know they were not forgotten. But how could words suffice in the face of such pain? The darkest days came when defeats piled upon defeats. At Fredericksburg, thousands fell in futile assaults. At Chancellorsville, the enemy outmaneuvered us once again. Each time I hoped for a turn in the tide, each time hope slipped through my fingers like smoke. The South believed themselves invincible, and many in the North began to believe it too. At night, in the solitude of my office, I felt despair gnaw at me. I questioned whether I had been foolish to think the Union could be preserved. I wondered if I was leading my people into ruin, if my stubbornness would cost more lives than surrender might save. The weight of doubt was suffocating, and yet something in me would not yield. Perhaps it was stubbornness, perhaps faith, perhaps the memory of my boy's face, reminding me that loss must have meaning. I told myself that if we surrendered, if we allowed the Union to fracture, then all those graves would be for nothing. Every soldier, every son, every father would have died in vain. That I could not allow. I clung to small sparks of hope. A victory at Antietam, though costly, gave us ground enough to stand upon. It was then I began to consider a bold step, not only to preserve the Union but to redefine it, to turn the war from a fight for union into a fight for freedom. But even before that step, I wrestled with the darkness that surrounded me. Mary's grief consumed her. My own loneliness deepened. Whispers of assassination circled like vultures. Friends urged me to rest, to sleep, to protect myself. But how could I rest when the nation itself could not rest? The war pressed into every corner of life. Prices rose, riots broke out, men resisted the draft. Families cursed me for taking their sons, others cursed me for not ending the war swiftly enough. To some I was tyrant, to others, savior. I lived in the space between their hatred and their hope. I aged swiftly in those years. The mirror showed lines deepening on my face, hair turning gray, eyes sunken with fatigue. I scarcely recognized the man staring back at me, but perhaps that was fitting. For I was no longer the man who had split rails in silence, nor the lawyer who argued in dusty courthouses. I was something else now, something shaped by grief, by doubt, by a nation's agony. And though the darkness pressed close, I held fast, for I believed still stubbornly that the Union could endure, that freedom could be preserved, that even in the darkest war, light remained possible. But that was not the whole story, for soon, the war would change shape, and with it, I would be forced to make the boldest choice of my life, one that would bind my name forever to both freedom and controversy. War alone was never enough. Armies marched, men bled, battles came and went, yet the Union seemed no closer to peace. Each victory was fleeting, each defeat deepened the wound. I knew, as surely as I knew the lines in my own hand, that the struggle could not be won on battlefield alone. It required something larger, something that would give the war a meaning greater than survival. That meaning was freedom. Slavery had haunted every chamber of Congress, every election, every law debated since the nation's birth. It was the question no compromise could silence, the wound no bandage could cover. When I took office, I told myself my duty was only to preserve the Union, not to interfere with what states held sacred. But as the war deepened, as graves multiplied, I felt the truth pressing harder. The Union could not be preserved unless slavery ended. The decision came slowly, like dawn breaking through fog. I weighed it night after night, pacing the floor of my office, the papers before me blank, but my mind filled with argument. If I declared freedom for the enslaved, would it rally us or ruin us? Would it unite the North or divide it further? Would it drive border states into rebellion? Would it invite defeat before victory could be won? Whispers reached my ears daily. Some urged me to act boldly, to strike at slavery as both moral and strategic weapon. Others begged me to hold back, warning that such a step would shatter what fragile support remained. Even in my own cabinet, voices clashed like swords. Some believed emancipation madness, others believed it inevitable. In the end, I listened to all but chose alone, but chose. I wrote the words carefully, my hand trembling at times, my heart heavy with the weight of what they meant. I knew that once spoken, they could not be recalled. I knew they would bind me forever in history's judgment. When I signed the Emancipation Proclamation, I felt a stillness settle upon me. My hand had made the strokes, but it was as though history itself had guided them. I declared that all enslaved persons in states then in rebellion were to be free. The words were plain, almost dry in their legal form, yet behind them burned a fire that had smoldered since the nation's founding. The reaction was as fierce as I had feared. Some hailed me as a liberator, a Moses leading people from bondage. Others cursed me as a tyrant, swearing I had destroyed the Union, that I had overstepped all authority. The South raged, declaring my words proof that I sought not reunion but ruin. Even in the North, riots broke out, anger rising from those who feared freedom for the enslaved would mean ruin for themselves. Yet despite the fury, something had changed. The war was no longer only about union, it was about freedom. Every battle fought after that carried not only the weight of territory, but the weight of human lives lifted from chains. I visited soldiers after the proclamation, and I saw it in their eyes. Some fought with renewed conviction, believing now that their cause was larger than themselves. Others grumbled, unwilling to risk their lives for men they considered beneath them. Division did not vanish with my words. If anything, it deepened. But I had no doubt that it was necessary. I remember once speaking with a delegation that urged me to retreat, to soften, to rescind. I told them plainly, I cannot turn back. If I could save the Union without freeing a single slave, I would have done it before. But now, I see the Union cannot be saved without freedom. The proclamation also carried weight beyond our shores. Nations in Europe, long debating whether to support the Confederacy, hesitated now. For to side with the South meant to side with slavery, and while politics could twist, public opinion in Britain and France could not so easily be turned. By declaring freedom, I had given the Union not only a moral cause, but a shield against foreign recognition of our enemies. Still, I carried doubt. Each night, as I laid down my weary head, I wondered if I had doomed us instead of saved us. Would the freedmen truly be free, or would hatred only bind them in new ways? Would the proclamation bring hope, or only deepen the bloodshed? Would history call me liberator or destroyer? I thought too of the men and women themselves, the millions who had lived their lives in bondage. Did my words reach them? Did they hear whispers of freedom carried on the wind? Or were they drowned in the sound of chains? I longed to believe they felt the weight of my pen, that somewhere in the darkness of their cabins, a spark had been lit. And yet, I knew freedom is never given easily. It must be fought for, carried, protected. My words were only the beginning. The battles ahead would decide whether those words had power or were nothing but ink upon paper. The war raged on, bloodier than before. Fields turned red, rivers ran thick with bodies. At Gettysburg, thousands fell in 3 days, the land itself soaked with sacrifice. I walked among the graves, rows upon rows stretching into silence, and I wondered again what meaning could justify such loss. It was there, in that quiet place of death, that I spoke words which came from the marrow of my soul. I reminded those who listened, and perhaps myself most of all, that this nation was conceived in liberty, that the dead had not died in vain, that government of the people, by the people, for the people must not perish from the earth. Even now I hear the echo of that field, the stillness broken only by the wind. I spoke of new birth, but it was spoken not with triumph, but with grief. For I knew freedom, once declared, must be reborn again and again through struggle unending. Chains had been broken, yes, but the work of freedom was only beginning. The tide of war shifted slowly but surely. What once seemed endless defeat began to turn toward hope. New generals rose, men of firmer resolve, willing to fight as the war demanded. Grant, grim and steady, pressed forward without rest, wearing down the enemy through persistence more than brilliance. Sherman cut a path to the sea, his march a trail of fire that broke the Confederacy's will. Piece by piece, the South began to falter. Yet victory was never simple. Each triumph came with bodies piled high, with letters to mothers and widows written by trembling hands. Each mile gained was paid in blood. I could not rejoice as others did, for I knew the price. Even as news of victories reached me, I bowed my head, feeling the weight of each name, each life carried upon it. As the war neared its end, I prepared myself for what must follow. Healing would be harder than war. A nation so bitterly divided does not mend by proclamation. Brothers who had fought each other do not embrace easily. I knew the Union would survive, but survival is not peace. In my second inaugural address, I spoke not with triumph, but with humility. The crowd before me was vast, the air thick with expectation. They expected victory speeches, promises of retribution, vows of glory. Instead, I offered reflection. I spoke of the scourge of slavery, of the judgments of the Almighty, of the need for malice toward none, with charity for all. I told them we must bind up the nation's wounds, care for those who had borne the battle, strive for a just and lasting peace. Some wept as I spoke, others frowned, demanding harsher words, harsher measures. But I could not speak vengeance, for vengeance solves nothing. I had seen too much death to crave more. What I longed for was mercy, and mercy is the harder path. Still, whispers clung to me, whispers that I was too lenient, too forgiving, too eager to welcome the South back without punishment. My enemies in the North muttered that I betrayed the cause by seeking reconciliation. My enemies in the South muttered that I was a tyrant cloaked in gentleness. To some I was too harsh, to others too kind. I could not satisfy them, nor did I try. Beyond the debates of policy, darker whispers spread. Whispers of men who plotted in shadows, who cursed my name not only in words, but in intent. Threats had followed me since my journey to Washington, and with each year they grew louder. Letters arrived promising my death, warnings of daggers and bullets sent by unseen hands. I grew accustomed to them, almost numb. Yet I knew some threats were not empty. Even in victory's dawn, shadows lengthened around me. The war was ending, but hatred had not. Where chains were broken, resentment was forged. Where peace was offered, violence brewed. At times I walked the White House at night, the corridors dim, the silence deep. I thought of the war's beginning, of Fort Sumter's guns, of the endless dispatches of loss. I thought of my son Willie, buried while the nation burned. I thought of the countless mothers who would never see their boys return, and I wondered if I would live to see the peace I had prayed for. The nation was weary, but I was weary too. Lines etched deeper into my face, my body bent under the strain of years without rest. Friends told me I looked decades older than when I first entered office. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps the war had carved me as surely as the axe had carved the rails of my youth. And yet amid the sorrow there was hope. I saw freedmen stepping into light, their chains gone, their futures uncertain but their dignity undeniable. I saw soldiers laying down arms, exhausted but alive. I saw a union battered, scarred, but still standing. That was no small thing. Victory was near. The enemy's capital would soon fall, their armies surrender. The war that had torn us apart for 4 years would at last be ending. The Union would be preserved, slavery broken, the great test endured. But as victory drew near, I could not shake the feeling that my part in it was nearly done. I spoke often to those around me of my plans, to travel, to return to Springfield, to live quietly once my term was finished. I dreamed of rest, of walking again in fields not haunted by war. But dreams are fragile things, easily broken. For even as the nation looked toward peace, I felt the shadows gather closer. Hatred does not vanish with surrender. Some men cannot forgive even mercy, and I, more than any, bore the mark of their resentment. Some said I would not live to see the peace I had spoken of. Others whispered that conspiracies moved even within the capital, unseen hands weaving their plans. I smiled at such talk in public, but in private I wondered if it was true, and as I look back now, I see that it was. The war was nearly done. Richmond had fallen, Lee's army was faltering, and the Union, bloodied but unbroken, stood at the threshold of peace. In those days, I felt a lightness I had not known in years. The burden had not left me, but it had grown bearable. I could smile again, if only faintly, if only briefly. I remember the last days well. I rode through Washington, the people cheering, their faces bright with hope. Freedmen gathered in the streets, lifting their hats, their voices breaking with gratitude. Soldiers saluted me, their eyes weary but shining. For a moment I allowed myself to feel it, that all the loss, all the sorrow had not been in vain. That home I spoke with Mary of our plans. We dreamed of returning to Springfield, of walking once more in familiar fields, of living quietly after so many storms. I thought of sitting again by my own hearth, free at last of dispatches and demands, hearing only the laughter of my sons. I longed for rest, and I believed it was near, but shadows never release so easily. I knew there were those who hated me still, men who saw not peace in my words but punishment in my actions. To them I was tyrant, destroyer, despoiler of their cause. They whispered of revenge, and though I had lived long enough with such threats to grow numb, I sensed that danger walked closer now. On the evening of April 14th, I went to Ford's Theatre. It was Good Friday and the city was alive with celebration. The air held the sweetness of spring, the promise of renewal. Crowds gathered, eager for laughter, eager for joy. Mary wished for us to go, to see the play, to rest for one night from the endless weight of war. I agreed, though part of me longed instead for quiet at home. The theatre was bright, filled with music and laughter. We sat in the box above, the actors upon the stage below. For a time I allowed myself to forget the burdens of state, to let the sound of laughter carry me. I looked at Mary and saw in her face something of the girl I had first loved, before grief and sorrow had etched their lines. For a moment, I believed we might yet find peace together. And then darkness. I will not dwell on the act itself, for it belongs more to others than to me. The shot rang out. The chaos erupted. Mary's cry pierced the air. Pain flooded through me, sharp, consuming, then fading into strange stillness. I felt myself carried not by arms but by release. Some say death comes with terror, but for me it came with calm. I thought of Willie, waiting beyond the veil. I thought of the soldiers who had fallen, the slaves who had risen from bondage, the mothers who had wept. I thought of the Union, scarred but whole, and I felt no fear, only release. My body remained, but my spirit had moved on. I watched as they carried me across the street, as doctors worked in vain, as friends gathered in grief. I saw the candlelight flicker against the walls, the hush of voices heavy with sorrow, and I knew then that my part in the story was done. But stories do not end with men. The Union endured. Freedom, though fragile, spread its roots. My words, clumsy at times, plain at others, carried further than I had ever imagined. They were repeated, remembered, etched into stone. The boy who had once read by firelight in a log cabin now spoke still through the lips of generations. I was not perfect. I was not without fault, nor without failure. I was only a man, awkward, doubtful, often weary, always searching. Yet in my searching, I found something larger than myself. I found a cause worth more than life. If I could leave one thought to those who listen, it would be this. Greatness is not born of wealth or ease. It is forged in struggle, in doubt, in sorrow. It is found not in crowns or titles, but in the endurance of the common man who chooses to rise when he might have fallen. I was born in silence, in shadow, in poverty. I walked through grief, through ridicule, through storms that threatened to break me. And yet I endured. so too can you. As you rest now, listening to my story, know that the burdens you carry, the losses you endure, the doubts that haunt you, they do not diminish you, they shape you, they prepare you for a future you cannot yet see. For the night always ends and dawn always comes. And though my last night ended in the theater, my legacy lives in the dawn of freedom, in the union preserved, in the quiet hope that endures still. Rest now. Let the story settle. For though my voice falls silent, the lesson remains, that from the humblest cabin can rise a life that shapes a nation, and from the darkest war can rise the light of a new birth of freedom.